of the main objectives of this event was to introduce the team members of both assessments team. For now, as you know, we have 2 countries who is actively participating in the pilot assessment, is Armenia and Ukraine. In case in Armenia, Karen is the assessment leader, and in case of Ukraine is Svetlana Tokareva. So maybe let's start with the presentation, introduction of different participants, and maybe we can start with our ladies in Ukraine. Можно по-русски.
Здравствуйте, коллеги, еще раз. Меня зовут Светлана Токарева. Я возглавляю команду оценки и представляю Министерство финансов Украины. Что нам нужно еще сказать? Кто состоит?
Потому что нас много, поэтому мы можем так по-быстрому.
Спасибо.
Спасибо, Светлана. Кто следующий? Наталья?
Здравствуйте, здравствуйте, уважаемые коллеги. Наталья Остапюк. Я в команде Светланы по оценке бухучета в государственном секторе Украины. Очень приятно быть здесь. Спасибо.
Вам спасибо, Наталья, Светлана. Я вижу, что...
Добрый день.
Добрый день, Светлана.
Добрый день, коллеги.
Добрый день. Очень рады вас видеть. Спасибо, что вы подключились, нашли время.
Были немножко технические трудности. Людмила Гапоненко, Министерство финансов Украины, директор департамента методологии бухгалтерского учета и нормативного обеспечения аудиторской деятельности.
Ну, и, наверное, я представлюсь.
Да, пожалуйста.
Я Светлана Воробей, я заместитель министра финансов Украины. Один из секторов, за который я отвечаю, это бухгалтерский учет. Поэтому я здесь с вами.
Спасибо большое, Светлана, что вы тоже подключились. Мы вас очень рады видеть, несмотря на все. И, ну, я уже говорил, и в дальнейшем будем рассказывать, пока Украина у нас в лидерах в самом процессе оценки, поэтому мы очень рады за вас, за всю команду, и, соответственно, о деталях мы поговорим немножко попозже. Так, у нас осталась Людмила Ключник и кто-то еще, по-моему. И только Людмила.
Добрый день. Меня зовут Людмила Ключник. Я тоже член команды оценки и тоже рада быть в этой команде.
Спасибо большое, Людмила. Карен, наверное, тогда... вот Ирина Чевелюк.
Добрый день, меня зовут Ирина Чевелюк, я член оценки команды и работаю в Министерстве финансов Украины, отдел методологии бухгалтерского учета.
Спасибо, Ирина. Карен, можно по-русски или по-английски, как вы предпочитаете?
Давайте продолжим на русском. Я Карен из Министерства финансов Республики Армения и также руководитель assessment team, команды оценки. Со мной в команде участвуют Рафи и Гор, они также подключены. Нас не так уж много, мы 3. Вот и все. Спасибо.
Спасибо, Карен. Гор, может быть, от вас 2 слова?
Здравствуйте. Я Гор из отдела мониторинга финансовых отчетностей. в государственном секторе, и будет очень интересно, я думаю, сегодняшняя лекция. Спасибо.
Спасибо, Гор. Я Рафи не вижу в данный момент.
Я тут.
Вот. Что-то я смотрю.
Да, меня зовут Рафи, я представляю отдел методологии и бухучета Министерства финансов и являюсь одним из участников команды оценщиков из Армении. Спасибо.
Спасибо, Рафи. Ну, наверное, мы можем перейти к другим командам. Давайте, наверное, сначала предоставим слово Ливану и Олегу.
Приветствую я всех вас, рад вас видеть тут тоже. Надеюсь, что еще скоро встретимся. Я Ливан, на этот раз я как экстернал валидатор, да? Ну, я тут в Грузии представляю, профессор, я руковожу кафедрой бухучета, анализа и аудита.
Спасибо, Ливан. Олег? Олег, мы вас не очень хорошо слышим. Может быть, связь? Может быть, тогда попозже. Давайте перейдем к команде Всемирного банка. I will switch to English. Julian, Vladimir, can you hear the interpretation on the English channel?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Yes, I can.
Perfectly. But still, Vladimir as well?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, I'm Dimitri Gurfinkel. I'm Senior Financial Management Specialist at the WorldBank and one of the co-task team leaders for the Pulsar program. And particularly, I was responsible for the development of the Pulse framework jointly with other colleagues from the Pulsar team and also with support from Zurich University and for the conceptual framework, and Vladimir for everything related to IT web tool. Natalia, maybe you?
Good afternoon, colleagues. Natalia Konovalenko, financial management consultant based in Vienna, and I supported the team with testing of the Pulse system. Thank you.
Arman, if you connected. Тогда, может быть, попозже. I also know that Jose Resk will be connecting a little bit later, so we will give him the opportunity to introduce himself once he is connected. Oksana, Lucine.
Good afternoon, colleagues. I'm Oksana Drut. I'm Senior Financial Management Specialist based in Moldova. I'm working for the World Bank. Thank you.
Thank you, Oksana. Lucine, is your connection better? Well, there are still some issues with the connection. I also assume that everybody by now knows Anara and Irma. They're part of the Pulsar team and they're always supporting all of us with all administrative logistic arrangements. But usually they are backstage, so we not always can see them. Okay, colleagues, I think we introduce ourselves. Can we share the screen with the presentation? I will do it myself. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. Well, colleagues, again, thank you very much for connecting. I hope you hear me well, even though I just realized that sometimes using WebEx, it's not very convenient because it looks like it's demand a lot of internet resources, and then the connection is not very stable. So probably next time we will use Zoom that also offers the simultaneous interpretation option. So today is the launch event of our pulse assessment. For now, we have 2 countries working on that, even though Moldova also confirmed once again that they are also on board. It was just this weekend they were not able to connect to the event. However, we hope that soon they will be able to start the assessment activities and start working on the concept note. So we have a pretty comprehensive presentation today, but hopefully it doesn't take too long, probably around an hour and 15 minutes. And as you can see, the main objective of this event, I already mentioned it, is introduce the members of both assessment teams, Pulsar team, external validators, and as well provide general and more specific information useful for the assessment process. The proposed agenda is introduction, which we already did, deliver the Pulse presentation, which mainly based on the Pulse handbook, and I hope that all of you have the document at this point. If not, let me know. Then we will discuss the next steps and timeline for each of 2 teams and countries, and finally respond to any questions, comments, concerns you may have. Something very important also is to remember and keep in mind the objective of this Pulse pilot. Since it's not only to test the implementation of the web-based assessment tool, but also identify any potential inconsistencies or glitches or issues in both the conceptual framework of the assessment and also the tool. And even though we just beginning the process, we have already identified several issues, including the process with the review of the concept note, and Vladimir and I later will meet and discuss in details what have been these issues and how they can be addressed. The other objective is also detect any potential web-based tool glitches during the pilot test. The pilot application countries are Armenia, Ukraine, but also our colleagues from Brazil, which is a little bit separate process because they're going to self-fund their needs. But we are also working with them and they're following the framework. The potential countries for the second round of the pilots are Albania, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Moldova. A little bit of Pulse background, even though you're probably already familiar with that. So the Pulse stands for Public Sector Accounting Assessment, and it provides a single tool to measure and report on both the conceptual and actual implementation of accrual accounting standards for the public sector based on the International Public Sector Accounting Standards. It also enables the identification of disconnects between the national and international public sector accounting frameworks, as well as the level of actual compliance with IPSAS-based practices. And this we will review in more details how this differentiation between the conceptual and practical perspective works in practice. The poll's objectives are support national and subnational governments in developing efficient and effective public sector accounting systems. And it also helps the public sector entities to develop an understanding of local public sector accounting system and environment, any potential gap between the national and international framework, and the gap in actual application between the national public sector accounting standards and the international public sector accounting standards. Some of the key benefits of implementing public sector accounting system, which you already know very well by now, are related to accountability, transparency, and improving the financial management. But there is also a higher level link between the public sector accounting and public financial management, since the use of accrual accounting also contribute to ensuring fiscal stability and the promotion of national economic growth over time. It also improves the acceptability and credibility of governments and improve and enhance the quality of public service provided. There is also link between pulse assessment and NASA assessment tool. And specifically, as you know, pulse is kind of extension or second improved version of the REP assessment tool, report on the enhancement of public financial reporting. And in some of the countries, including Ukraine, recently conducted the assessment based on the REP methodology. As you also know, PULSE is very much based on Public Expenditure Framework Assessment, also known as PIFA. The PULSE framework was designed in close collaboration actually with our colleagues from PIFA Secretariat, and it's based on the fundamental principle of PIFA assessment, including the evidence-based scoring and mandatory quality assurance procedures. There is also a link with the fiscal transparency evaluation framework used by International Monetary Fund, which takes into consideration the Fiscal Transparency Handbook and the Fiscal Transparency Code. Some of the PULSE characteristics are the following. It's expected to become a global good and user-friendly web-based self-assessment tool, free of charge, available to any interested party to use it. It's designed for national and subnational government, but it may be also applied by any reporting entity, such as international organizations, central banks, public corporations, and other governmental agencies. It systematically collects information on the current performance of public sector accounting systems, standards, and practices. And it offers one single tool to measure and report on both the conceptual and actual implementation of accrual accounting standards. It also provides inputs for development of a comprehensive public sector accounting reform strategy and roadmap, and use assessment to develop policy recommendation and action planning to enable further strengthening of public sector accounting systems and practices. The assessment framework is based on one hand on the PIFA assessment framework and on the other hand on the IPSAS and the latest set of IPSAS pronouncements, which means that the PULSE assessment framework will be revised periodically and updated based on the latest IPSAS. The quality of the assessment and the final report is ensured through multi-layer quality assurance arrangements, including external validation process and pulse check. Very briefly about the pulse structure, there is 6 pillars, 29 indicators, and 102 dimensions in total. It worth noticing that the pillar 1, public sector accounting framework, and the last pillar, reform prerequisite and capability, only has a single score. There is no differentiation between conceptual and practical application of the standards. Respectively, the pillar, all the indicators and dimension of the pillars 2, 3, 4, and 5 will have this double scoring system. In terms of the pulse assessment process, there are 4 phases and 10 steps in total. It's expected that the estimation duration of the assessment should be no more than 6 months. However, since we are now piloting the tool, this framework is flexible and could be adjusted as needed. The main phases, actually, we're going to review them in the next few slides. So the first phase is planning, and it basically has 3 steps. The first one has to do with the dialogue and start with the initiation of the dialogue and definition of the ownership over the assessment. It also includes assignments of roles and responsibilities and identification of resource requirement, if any. The second step has to do with the preparation and approval of the concept note, and it includes the preparation of the concept note itself, the peer review, and the finalization and the approval of the concept note. And the final step of this phase is the mobilization of the assessment and external validation teams, identification of data requirements and sources, preparation of the independent review of assessment results. And in case of both Armenia and Ukraine, we are still in this phase 1. Even though in case of Ukraine, we are already in the final phase of finalization of the concept note and hopefully its prompt approval. The second phase is assessment. The first step has to do with the launch of the assessment, and this kind of launch or workshop event that we are having right now. So we are a little bit advancing that step, since again it's a pilot application of the tool. So we decided that having this technical workshop is relevant to have it as early as possible. And the next step is data collection and analysis. So once the concept note is approved, the assessment team should look at all required supporting documentation and data, which should be available through the system, should be uploaded to the system, and start with the assessment of the performance indicators and dimensions based on the methodology. Once the assessment is complete, the external validators will proceed with the validation of the initial or raw data of the assessment. The third phase is the reporting, which has to do with the preparation of first draft pulse report, then the quality assurance of the of the draft report, conducting pulse check if agreed, revision and finalization of the draft pulse report, and finally approval of the pulse report and publication and its respective publication. The last phase of the assessment process is public sector accounting reform action, which has 2 steps. The first one is reform dialogue, which has to do with the management of the dialogue, reform design, planning, and implementation, which has to do basically to identify what are the critical areas for improvement in terms of the current public sector accounting systems and practices, and how these areas could be improved through development of a comprehensive action plan. And the last step is monitoring the evaluation to ensure that the proposed action plan is timely implemented and follow up. I think I will stop here for now. And Natalia, I think you are next.
Thank you very much, Dmitry. So let us quickly go through the pulse coverage and scope and assessment mode. So talking about pulse coverage, we understand that the governments and other public sector entities are organized in different ways around the world. So it means that different ministries, agencies, departments, etc., are in different countries, and PULSE recognizes that. So its framework, the PULSE framework, was designed in a way assuming it to be conducted by national or subnational governments, maybe at central or regional level. However, so that it could also be used by other entities, for instance, state-owned enterprises, central banks, or others. The coverage of consolidated entities will depend on the local context in this case and the number of controlled entities by the reporting entities. And next slide, Dmitry, please. You're talking about pool scope. The most recently completed fiscal year is usually used as a basis for pools assessment. The scope of each indicator may vary depending on the organizational structure of the report undergoes assessment. It's also important to note that it's imperative that the scope is clearly defined at the planning phase and based on the reporting entity which is being assessed. Also, it should be taken into consideration that in some cases, the information on such aspects like defense, public order, and safety function may be unavailable for reasons of the national security. And if that is the case, if there are any limitations affecting the scope of the assessment, they should be clearly identified and noted in the introduction of the report. There are three options how the assessment may be carried out, or three so-called assessment modes, which are self-assessment, external assessment, and blended mode assessment. Full self-assessment approach is a primary assessment mode, and in this case, the assessment is undertaken by the lead agency. It is supported by the mandatory external validation. In exceptional cases, the two other modes of assessment may be used, and these two other modes are external assessment mode, which is conducted by external experts, and blended mode, which is a combination of a self-assessment with assistance from external experts. When choosing the option of the assessment mode, one should consider specific jurisdictional situation like resources availability, like institutional capacity, and other aspects that may have impact in specific. I'm passing over to Julian for presenting on the next slide.
Thank you, Natalia and Dmitry. Now we will go deeper into the PULSE framework, the structure, and also how to score the different indicators and dimensions. First of all, as Dmitry said, we have in the PULSE framework, we have 6 pillars, 29 indicators and 102 dimensions. Those pillars are structured in a logical sequence if we consider, for example, the preparation of financial information. So we would have the PSA framework first, then assets and liabilities, then expenses and revenue, then the financial statements reporting and preparation, and after that, the reform. So those are the 6 pillars, and now we will analyze them. Just an overview, of course, because there are a lot of indicators and dimensions, but just as to have an overview, as I said, here we have the first pillar, which is PSA framework, public sector accounting framework, which has 3 indicators: the conceptual framework, accounting policies, foreign currency transactions, and hyperinflation effects. And if you see on the right-hand side, we have the IPSAS column. This one can indicate which IPSAS are related to each indicator. And except for PI, which is the indicator 1, and the pillar 6, all the other indicators have an IPSAS or more than one standard related. So, for example, accounting policies, estimates, errors, and events after reporting date is related to IPSAS 3 and 14. And as you can see here, we have some indicators that have 3 or 4 dimensions. The indicators can have from 2 to 4 dimensions. We will see this in the following slides. So this is just to be familiarized with the structure of the different indicators and pillars. Dimitri, please, the next slide. Thank you. So the second pillar, as I said before, is financial assets and liabilities. Here we have, again, following a logical sequence, assets first, liabilities then, and some specific examples of financial assets or liabilities, such as derivatives, hedge accounting. And in this case, for example, all of them have 4 dimensions. So when we evaluate, we will see this later, when we do the assessment, we have to assess every single dimension, and the score will be obtained by evaluating all the dimensions and all the requirements for each dimension. And as we can see here, most of the indicators, assets, liabilities, derivatives, are related to IPSAS 5 or are linked with IPSAS 5 and 41, and offsetting disclosures presentation is related to IPSAS 21 and 30. So this is pillar 2. Dimitri, please. Thank you. The third pillar is I think we should go back, please, to the... Okay, thank you. Yes, the previous one, please. No, the next, I'm sorry. Okay, good. Thank you. Apologize. Okay, so here, this is the longest pillar, which has 8 indicators. These indicators vary from inventories, biological assets, leases, property, plant, and equipment. This is fixed assets. Not only recognition and measurement, but also first-time adoption and depreciation. So for each indicator, we have to see which the dimensions are, and then when we go to the scoring methodology, we will see that each of them has a specific requirement to be assessed. So this is again the general structure, and now we will go forward to the next slide, please. This is thank you. This is the second part of pillar 3, which again is non-financial assets and liabilities, and this is the longest one. So we have things like intangible assets, indicators 13, 14 service concessions, 15 impairment, 16 provisions, contingent liabilities and assets, and employee benefits, each of them, as I said before, linked with a specific IPSAS. And as you can see here, except for indicator 14, which has 3 dimensions only, then the rest have 4 dimensions. Having more dimensions, I will speak about this later, means that we need more, we have more work to do in terms of the assessment. We have more aspects to assess or to evaluate. So this is pillar 3, please. Next slide. This is pillar 4, which is expenses and revenue recognition in an actual system. This is related to the profit and loss account, or we have the results for an entity, for a reporting entity. We have the exchange transactions, where we have rendering of services, sales of goods, interest, royalties. This is IPSAS 9 related. Revenue from non-exchange transactions, that's like tax, for example, which is, of course, or transfer, which are very important aspects in PFM system of any country. And social benefits, these 3 aspects are the ones that will be assessed during the assessment of the pillar number 4, which, as I said before, would be what we analyze after assets and liabilities. The next one, please. Next slide. Thank you. After we finish analyzing assets, liabilities, of course, the framework first, then we go to the financial reporting and consolidation. This is where we prepare the financial statements. So we'll have here the presentation of financial statements itself with all the completeness and information we should have, the notes to the financial statements, which, as you know, are part of the financial statements. And what, in general, what we analyze here is completeness, accuracy, to make sure that all the requirements from IPSAS are included in the financial statements prepared by a reporting entity. So it's important to take into consideration that all of this will be assessed and very detailed, both, as Dimitri said, from a conceptual and actual perspective. It's not only what the policies say, but also what is really in place, what is implemented, and what is working in a reporting entity. Then we have an important point which can apply for some reporting entities, perhaps not for others, which is accounting for non-control entities and public sector combinations in case they exist. And finally, PI 24, the indicator 24, which is consolidated financial statements, which is, of course, is also very important in ESA, in public sector accounting. Dimitri, next one, please. Thank you. And then the final pillar, pillar number 6, is the reform prerequisites and capacities. In this case, as I mentioned earlier, we don't have a specific IPSA related. So, for example, if we speak about integration with other PFM systems, with, for example, the chart of accounts or the treasury single account, which are important parts of the PFM system, there's not a specific IPSA. It's more related to the management itself, to the public financial management itself. And then the IFMIS, the Integrated Financial Management Information Systems, then there what we have to analyze is, for example, if it's accrual-based or not. That's something, of course, very important if we want to implement IPSAS. how the system captures information and processes information, if the consolidation is automatic or not, human resources and capacity, the accounting function, how it is structured, if it's independent or not, how it works in general. And this is the first step to the next one, which is the reform, which of course, and it was mentioned and will also be mentioned later, is the final objective of having the assessment, having information in order to move forward to the next step, which is the reform action. Okay, so this, as I said, are the 6 pillars. We had a very brief overview on the 29 indicators, and we had here the 102 dimensions. So now we'll go to the next slide, please. And we'll see, well, now we understand, we know how the framework works, how it is structured. Now, how do we score? How do we obtain a score for all these indicators and dimensions? First of all, it's important to understand that the assessment methodology is aligned to the PIFA methodology. So those of you who are familiar with PIFA will also be familiar with the 4-point calibration scale between A and D. It's the same one as PIFA uses, with some differences that we'll see later. For example, this thing about the conceptual and actual perspective that's not mentioned in PIFA. But it's important to understand in this general scoring methodology overview that each dimension is scored separately. So the aggregate score of an indicator is the result of how we evaluate, or the score obtained by each single dimension. So if it's a 4-dimension indicator, then the score for that indicator will be the result of those 4 dimensions that compose that indicator. So the overall score for the reporting entity will be the result of the score for each dimension and the score for each indicator. It's important that every single aspect of all the dimensions has different requirements that have to be fulfilled. If one of the requirements is not fulfilled, then it affects the score of the dimensions. We'll have some examples later to understand this. So please, the next slide. Thank you. So there are 2 exceptions for this scale, for grade scale from A to D, that are D asterisk, the D asterisk score, and an A or not applicable. The D asterisk is something that happens when sufficient information is not available or not found. When you are assessing an indicator, you are expecting to find the data, but if it's not there or you don't have enough information, then perhaps the score should be a D asterisk. And not applicable is occurs when an indicator or dimension may not be applicable to a specific reporting entity. For example, let's say if a reporting entity does not consolidate information or does not have a combined structure or information, then that specific indicator is not applicable. It has to be considered that only a few dimensions could be NA or not applicable. If more than 25%, that is 26 out of 102 dimensions, are deemed as not applicable, then I would say it doesn't make much sense. So that's why the pulse check cannot be obtained. It will depend on each entity. All the entities are not the same, but it's important to understand that some aspects perhaps are not applicable as derivatives, for example, if it's the case, or contingent liabilities. So these are the two exceptions that exist. So the next slides, please. Okay, so this is how we score the four grade, or the four grade scale that we can have from A to D. To obtain an A, of course, it's the ideal, but it's not easy in general. The handbook, the Pulse handbook, which serves as a guide or the framework, is very strict. So to get an A or to obtain an A, you need, or the reporting entity needs, to have a high performance level with full compliance. And that's not easy if you consider that each dimension has different requirements. Of course, that's the ideal, and let's be optimistic that most of the assessed entities will have a lot of A's, but it has to be considered that in order to get an A, there shouldn't exist certain gaps to the IPSAS, because if that happens, then we go to the B. If there's a basic level of performance for each indicator and dimension, then perhaps they're still consistent with IPSAS or good international practices, but the score will be a C. And if the score is below these basic requirements, then it's a D. As I said before, also D asterisk exists, but this criteria seems to be a little subjective here, but it's really objective. And we will see that in the examples, how we consider if it's A, B, or C, or even D. So this is the general scoring methodology. So the next slide, please. Okay, so the aggregate score depends on the number of dimensions per indicator. There's a table in the handbook, a conversion table, that determines the aggregate score. That conversion table is prepared for indicators with 2, 3, or 4 dimensions. So this is, for example, what you're seeing on the screen. This showed here is an example of 4-dimensional indicators, but you have the same for 3, 4, 2, and all the potential combinations. So you will have an idea of how you get the score. You can see that, for example, here you have B+, or you have different options of how to get the final score again for each dimension. Thank you. Well, the next one, please. Thank you. So, as I said before, each dimension is evaluated separately. There has to be compliance with all the requirements. Sampling can be used sometimes when it's justified. For example, you can analyze a certain number of transactions if it's justified, and the handbook provides guidance on that. The score starting from C is basic level, as I said. Of course, we all aim to have an A, but that's not as easy. And materiality is relevant. And this is very, very important. Let's go to the next slide, and I will explain why. Because materiality speaks about some words, some terms we'll find in the methodology, in the framework. So if we said all transactions will refer to 90% or more. If we say most transactions or most items, it's 75% or more. For example, let's say 12,000 out of 15,000 revenue transactions are recorded this way. So you have to see how much this represents, which percentage, and according to that, it's majority is more than 50%. So these aspects are really relevant in order to see how we get the score. The next one, please. Next slide. Thank you. This is really important. This is one of the crucial things about the methodology, the scoring methodology, and I would say the PULS methodology in general, that it has both conceptual and actual perspectives. This is different to PIFA, as I said before. So conceptual is mostly related to the framework, the policies, the procedures, while the actual perspective is how it is implemented and applied. So the regulations on one hand side, conceptual, and then how they are implemented on the other hand side. So if you want to evaluate, the assessment requires to evaluate, to assess, to have a score for both perspective, conceptual and actual, with some exceptions, but in most of the indicators, we have both perspectives they need a score. Next one, please. Thank you. So now we'll have some examples in general. So in PI 20, the indicator 20, social benefits, for example, the accounting manual says or specifies that cash transfers to specific individuals or households which mitigate social risks should be presented as a social benefit. That's what the manual says. So that's a conceptual perspective. If the manual says exactly this, then perhaps it's an A. But if the financial statements that are prepared supposedly according to the manual show that cash transfers are registered as general advance payments and not as social benefits, as the conceptual perspective says, then the actual perspective, what is really in place, will have a lower score. So that's why both things have to be assessed and analyzed. We will have some more examples later. So move to the next one, please. Thank you. For example, let's see how these requirements work. In PI 3, the indicator 3, foreign currency transactions and hyperinflation effects. In this case, we have, for example, for the dimension 1, which is initial recognition of exchange differences, we have 2 requirements, and both of them have to be assessed and have to comply. So it's not only that exchange differences resulting from transactions are recognized in the surplus or deficit in the period, but also if we want to have the A, we need that the total amount of exchange difference is disclosed in the notes. So just to be more clear, if they are not disclosed in the notes, but they are shown in the period they arise and are recognized properly, perhaps we will get a B. If we don't have the disclosure in notes, we cannot get the A. Okay, so again, we will have more examples, but this is a case with 2 requirements. The next one, please. Next slide. This is indicator 4, financial assets. It looks more complex, and it is. Here we have 4 requirements. That is, the basic one is a financial assets is recognized or are recognized at fair value and not historical value. And that all requirements of initial measurements are met, that all requirements of subsequent measurements are also met, and that all requirements of the recognitions are met. So, for example, if we have at least 3 requirements of the recognition and the rest is complied, then perhaps we would get a B. If we want to get an A, again, all the requirements of the recognition have to be met. So as you can see here, for example, if we get a D, it's because we didn't have the basic level to get the C. This is how it works, and this is financial assets at fair value. This is a specific dimension of the financial assets indicator. The next slide, please. Thank you. So this is another example, but not about an indicator, but how you score and how you get a score for the actual and conceptual perspective. This is for foreign currency transactions and hyperinflation effects. And during the assessment for the dimension 1, which is initial recognition, it could be identified that the exchange differences resulting from transactions with monetary and non-monetary items are recognized in the surplus or deficit. But however, the total amount of exchange differences is not disclosed in notes. And look at this phrase, following what is indicated in the accounting policies in place. So this means the accounting policies say that the amount of exchange differences should not be disclosed in notes. This is why both conceptual and actual perspective have the same score. If the accounting policies said that they should have been recognized or disclosed in notes, then perhaps the actual would have been B, but the conceptual would have been A, because again, conceptual is what the framework, the regulations say. Okay, so this is an interesting example. Let's go to the next one, please. Thank you. In this case, we have a difference. We don't have the same score for both conceptual and actual perspective. This is presentation of financial statements, indicator number 21. Dimension 4, degree of completeness, the cash flow statement. In this case, and I will be very brief here, just not to take more time, but the manual, the accounting manual, says exactly what IPSAS stipulate about how the cash flow statements should be shown or should be completed, or how the information it should have. But it was noted during the evaluation that the entity prepares a cash flow statement which classifies only the cash flows by operating, investing, and financing activities, not cash equivalent, and also not they don't use the direct method. So in this case, the conceptual perspective is perfect, so the score is an A, but the actual perspective is a C because it doesn't meet the requirements for this specific dimension. That would have been that cash equivalent is also included and in the cash flow statement, of course, and that the cash flow from operating activities were calculated directly and not indirectly. So this is again another example. Let's go to the next one, please. Consolidation procedures in the indicator consolidation financial statements, PI 24. The accounting regulations in place specify that consolidated financial statements must be prepared using uniform accounting policies on a line-by-line basis, eliminating all transactions between entities. During the assessment, we could analyze, let's see, this is an example, of course, that in the last 2 completed fiscal years, uniform accounting policies were used on line-by-line basis. This is fine, but eliminating only more than 10,000 out of 12,567 transactions. So the conceptual perspective, again, is fine because the regulations in place say is specifically what the handbook, the Pulse handbook specifies. But when we go to the actual, when we move to the actual perspective, we could see that only some transactions, which in this case are most, because it's more than 75%, remember that when we spoke about materiality, that really matters, then if as it's most and not all the transactions, then the actual score for this dimension is B. This is again another example. The next one, please. Next slide. Okay, thank you. This is the final example. PI 26, Integrated Financial Management Information Systems. Remember that in this case, this is pillar 6, we didn't have IPSAS related, and in this case, we don't have differences. PI 26 does not require to differentiate scores from actual and conceptual perspectives. So it's a single score for this indicator. In this case, it says that there are 322 budget entities in the public sector, and the system captures, records, and processes in the general ledger transactional information of only 167, which in this case is, if you make the calculations, of course, is more than 50%, so it's majority, again, speaking about materiality. Thus, the score for this dimension is C. It's not B because it's not that more than 75%, and it's, of course, it's not A because it's not all the transactions which have been 90% or more. So this is how we score. These were some general examples. I hope they were useful to understand how the scoring methodology works. I think we should move to the next slide. And
Thank you very much, Julian. Back to me. Dmitry, can you switch the slide, please? Thank you so much. So now we are coming from the substance of the assessment to the process on how it is organized in this system, who does what and when. And in the last part, we will go to the system itself. So talking about the supporting documents, dimensions, as you already part of the presentation, are assessed based on the specific legislation, national laws, regulations, other requirements, standards, documents, which need to be reflected in the system, in the assessment. It may be done either by providing links or by uploading these documents into the documents repository. So there are two types of supporting documents that may be used. General documents, which are, for example, laws, regulations, bylaws on accounting standards, policies, and those need to be uploaded either or indicated with or referred to with a link at the beginning of the assessment. And the second type of supporting documents are documents which are supporting individual dimensions, like specific sections of financial statements, like, for instance, IFMI screenshots, list of register fixed assets, valuation criteria of financial instruments, maybe others as well. So, as I said, it might be either a link to websites or documents uploaded to the repository website. Usually encouraged to side. When the documents are they can be accessed without restrictions or without any restriction when they're available to public. And also we may use, or you may use in doing assessment, a document repository on web-based tool. And in this case, you are uploading the document that you need in appropriate section. So it's not needed to upload document like if it's general, it's not needed to upload it to specific dimension, but you upload it in the repository and it's applicable to the whole section or the whole assessment. Slide, please. Can you switch the slide? Dmitry. But okay, here it is. So thank you very much. So here we can see how the supporting documents may be organized. So we are uploading documents like a constitution, laws, bylaws related to budget and accounting issues, annual budget, documentation estimates, etc. We are uploading documents for both parts, or not parts, for both considerations, for conceptual perspective and for actual perspective. So this is just like example how it may be organized and what those documents may include. So it may be general documents and maybe more specific documents, including even like job profiles and responsibilities. Next slide, please, Dmitry. Slide. Very much. So the next slide tells us about roles and responsibilities of stakeholders. And Dmitry already mentioned in the first part of this presentation. Now go back. Can you go back to the previous slide, please? So Dmitry mentioned in his part of the presentation, the stakeholders and the assessment team includes the lead agency, which carries out the assessment itself. We assume that it's a self-assessment. And assessment team leader, which carries out day-to-day management of the pools assessment process and bears the ultimate responsibility for the quality of the assessment conducted. And there is also oversight team, which usually consists of PFM and PSA reform steering committee or a technical task force reporting to a high-level steering committee members. And there is assessment team, which usually consists of lead agencies officials with potential support or support from external consultant. External validation team, which are usually international or national experts in public finance management or public or PSA, who are familiar with the national jurisdictional public sector accounting system and are familiar with reform which is being conducted or was conducted recently. Pulsar team consists of WorldBank officials and consultants who involved in implementation of this of the Pulsar program and who will support the teams mentioned before in this pulse assessment process. And there also may be external stakeholders like relevant actors such as line ministries involved in the assessment or officials from those ministries who are involved in the assessment. It may be development partners, accounting standard setters, professional organizations, and other NGOs, academia, etc. And there are also peer reviewers who are identified and nominated by the assessment team leader in consultation with the agency who is responsible for carrying out the assessment and oversight. Dmitry, can you? Can I go to the next slide, please? Thank you. I will not go in detail through the quality assurance process because said a lot about it already in the first part of this presentation. So basically it consists of four main stages or four phases, which are a concept note stage, assessment stage, work on pulse report, and it is a dissemination stage. And here on this slide, you see how online these steps are at each phase in online tool. So I will not go step by step, but discuss this. Can you please go to the next slide? I see that Dmitry texted in the chat that he has some connectivity issues, so may react with delays, which is fine. Dmitry, if you can hear me now, just switch to the next slide or even to the slide after the next one, because we have already covered the quality assurance process. Perfect. Perfect. So the main objective checks ensure the methodology has been applied correctly, the general scoring is evidenced, the current overall IPSAS adoption status and basis for financial reporting have been properly during the assessment process and are reflected in the final report. The pulse report structure and its content are in compliance with the pulse handbook. Recommendations and actions suggested in the action plan are reasonable and feasible for implementation. The next slide, please, Dmitry. The key criteria for pulse check include the following. The concept note is submitted for peer review before the assessment work starts, so that all elements needed to be included in this concept note and are properly planned at the initial phase of the assessment preparation. The other criteria is that the final version of the concept note is shared with all peer reviewers and pulse stakeholders. The first draft of pulse report needs to be submitted to all members of external validation team for review. And compliance indices for dimensions and indicators and the report coverage index are higher than 75%. So option of using pulse check may be omitted. Cases when it may be omitted, like for instance, maybe when the pulse report is not intended to be publicly disclosed. In this case, the pulse check may be omitted. However, it's like a helpful tool, and it is recommended to be conducted whenever it is possible. The inclusion of pulse check tool or lack of it should be highlighted in the distribution and dissemination in the version of the pulse report, which is going to be distributed and disseminated. So it should be clearly stated whether this pulse check external review tool was used to this assessment or it wasn't. You switch the slide, please. So let us briefly go through the pulse concept note structure. Most of you are already familiar with it, as you have already prepared the concept note yourself. So you know how it looks like, you know what should it include. But for those who do not know, who is not familiar with this process, go through its structure. So the concept note should include the country or jurisdiction, background and context, PSA reform, including mentioning any recent public sector accounting assessment if they have place, any recent ongoing or planned public sector accounting reform in the country. It should also include coverage of the assessment. These are the elements that we discussed earlier in this presentation. Timeline including assessment implementation schedule and estimated cost of the assessment should also be part of the concept note. Of course, this is just a tentative estimated cost, but the timeline should be is more feasible to estimate maybe. And it should include a raw breakdown of the main cost items. Other elements of the concept note include assessment management, like management and oversight arrangements on this assessment, composition of the assessment team, and Q&A arrangements. Also, approach to methodology and data collection structure of the pulse report should be part of the concept note. And key deliverables, including workshop to be delivered as part of this assessment launch or as at the final stage of the report dissemination, should be also part of the concept note. Petri, can you go to the next slide? Can you go to... So after the pulse check tool is used, and finalization of the final pulse should be distributed to all stakeholders, so it should be disseminated. All reports that have the complete pulsar. The final pulse report is completed. It should be also made available to the public, either in printed version or in any other readable form. published on the accessible website. Switch the slide, please. Perfect. Thank you very much. So, final report structure usually looks or recommended to have the following appearance or to have the following structure. It should consist of general information and executive summary. It should have introduction on rationale, purpose, scope, coverage, and the mode of assessment of this report. It should provide information on country background and public sector accounting environment. And of course, results, providing information on the results received during the assessment process, as well as findings and recommendations. Template of the Pulse final report is uploaded to the online system, so you can, when you start working on the report, you can download the template and see what sections it consists of, and drafting your report accordingly. So this is all on my side. I think I'm passing over to Jose, and perhaps it may be, yes, Jose, perhaps it may be really reasonable to share, if you share the presentation yourself, Dmitry, and maybe you stop sharing because, yeah, it's really maybe the connection is not very good and it's a bit delayed.
Dmitry, are you still connected?
Perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah. So can you share it, Jose?
Well,
if you have it?
I don't have it handy. If you have it, or Dmitry can project it.
Yeah, sure. Okay. I can share it.
Thank you very much. And good afternoon to everyone. Sorry I couldn't join before. It's a pleasure to meet all of you that I haven't had the chance. My name is Jose Resca. I'm also part of the team, and you might run across me for other Pulsar initiatives. So in the next few slides, we will speak about what's next. So we have a Pulse report now. We have a sound diagnostic of how our own public sector accounting system is closer or farther to the good practices. And now we have a strong gap analysis that we want to discuss at the government level to enhance it. So basically, the Pulse report should be used by the government normally if they are in a dialogue regarding public sector accounting, to continue this dialogue, or if this is the first step on the public sector accounting reform, this would be a great tool to start the dialogue on the future of the public sector accounting in the country and in the reform process. So it's important that we need to acknowledge that the path to reform is not static, so we need to keep our reform plans very flexible and adaptable, so we can ensure that all the desired outcomes are achieved. There's a document that was prepared under Pulsar that I will share with everyone in the chat that provides general guidance on how to approach any public sector accounting reform. There's a good practice template, and the document is called Roadmap to Public Sector Accounting Reform. Good practice template, you probably know it, and it's posted in our CFRR website. The public sector account reform action should have two key elements. One is reform dialogue that goes in parallel with monitoring, evaluation, and follow-up. And in the next few slides, we will speak first about the reform dialogue and then about the monitoring, evaluation, and follow-up. So on the reform dialogue front, it's very important that all key stakeholders are involved in the reform dialogue. And I've seen cases of, let's say, PIFA follow-up action plans where at the very, very last moment, for example, the Supreme Audit Institution was involved in the discussion. And it was at that point where a lot of additional activities that should be accompanying all the reform process were discovered and started, and that delays the reform process overall. So it's important that everyone who should have a say in the public sector accounting reform is involved in the dialogue. Government representatives, line ministries, accounting, standard setters, regulators, SAIs, development partners. The PULSE lead agency is the key the key incumbent to manage the dialogue. So in this case, normally would be the Ministry of Finance, but it can be other entities also. And this lead agency will be also accountable and responsible for all the decisions taken and the outcomes from the dialogue. Basically, the objective of having this reform dialogue is to build momentum and maintain the foundations of the reform actions that need to be established and executed. Next slide, please. So basically, in this template, there are several areas that would normally be covered in the reform design, planning, and implementation. Of course, it's very important to ensure that there's political support and willingness of all the key stakeholders so this reform can be carried out. So we need champions in the key institutions that are advocating for the reform. The second thing, of course, is you need to agree on the reform strategy, and you need to keep the timeline of implementation feasible. It's not just setting deadlines, but carefully thinking about each deadline in the foot of who will need to implement it. So we need to keep an open dialogue to see what's feasible and what's not. Because if you keep it very aggressive, it can have a negative impact because, of course, you can generate reform fatigue. You can have frustrations at the beginning of the process. So it's very important that the implementation timeline is feasible. You need to have a proper coordination mechanism and management arrangements on how communication will be established. Of course, the resources, including not only financial resources, but human resources and the IT structure that supports the reform, needs to be available. Of course, you will need the amendment of the current legal and regulatory frameworks in much of the cases. So that's something that it's also need to be considered. You need to define the structure of the new public sector accounting system. You have to define how risk will be managed and mitigated throughout the reform implementation. You need to have, this is very important, and also it's something that it's not so often seen. There needs to be a change management strategy. This will, as any reform, will have stakeholders more impacted than others, or as you normally would say, winners and losers of the reform. And you need to have that mapped in advance so you can generate the right incentives so losers would get compensated, and winners should also know that they will be favored by the reform. So there should be a constructive dialogue about the impact that the reform will have. Then something very important to consider is that whether there are different public financial management functions, there should be an integration of all these systems with the updated IFMIS, or whether you need to develop an IFMIS, an integrated financial management information system. The final area is about having monitoring and evaluation arrangements that are sound and that are well established from the beginning. So next slide, please. Basically, monitoring and evaluation is something vital and very important if you want to learn from the process and you want to mitigate the risks that arise throughout the implementation of the reform. Because any this information that you will gather through monitoring will be key to steer the boat if you need to, right? You need to incorporate all the relevant information to take into account for the improvement, right? So you need to take into account how reform is being implemented to not incur in the same errors in the future. So that's about the monitoring, and then there's a process that should be normally every a few years, which is the evaluation on how the reform worked, and that's important to fully understand what's the impact of the reforms in the public sector accounting systems. It's very important that in order to evaluate and assess how public sector accounting reform worked, you have a repeated assessment every typically 3 to 5 years. 5 years, it's kind of the magic number, but it will depend on the situation of each country. So basically, last slide, please. Monitoring and evaluation, it's a good practice to incorporate that into the reform strategy. And it can be done as follows. First, you need to have a monitoring body for the public sector accounting reform. Normally, since you already have for the pools steering committee and you have a pools oversight team, you can use either one or the other to monitor progress. Then you need to develop a framework to measure how the reform is going. Normally, it should capture the basic elements of what are the logical and expected cause-effect relationships between the inputs, outputs, intermediate results or outcomes, and the final impact. That's likely every WorldBank project. We have this what we call theory of change, and this is measured by the results framework. We would need to do something similar that's applicable to the public sector accounting reform. And in to follow up, as I mentioned, it would be very good to repeat the pulse assessment every 5 years, and this normally would show that there was a before and after of the reform, and that it would take stock of all the advancement that had been done by the reform, but at the same time, it could help to identify further areas in public sector accounting that need further strengthening. So with this, the process would restart again for those areas that need further work. So that's in a nutshell what we wanted to convey on GSA reform. So I think now it's back to Vladimir.
Thank you, Jose. Maybe before, can you hear me? I had to
Yes,
connect
yes, I can.
by phone. Okay, before going to Vladimir, I just realized that we missed introductions from Julian and Vladimir. So maybe Julian, Vladimir, could you briefly introduce yourself, and then we continue with Vladimir's presentation.
Well, thank you. I will start just on because you mentioned me first. My name is Julian. Well, you already heard me presenting some of the slides. I am one of the members of the WorldBank team. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for attending this presentation. And I will be helping during the pilot, the assessment, to clarify some technical aspects where needed. So thank you very much. Thank you, Dimitri, for inviting me. And I hope we can build a good team.
Thank you, Julian. Vladimir, are you there?
Yes. Hello. Good afternoon or good morning, depends where you are.
Vladimir,
I mean,
would you like to share the slides yourself, or you want me to share them?
if you can share them, it would be perfect. Thank you, Natalia. My name is Vladimir Calderon. I'm in charge of the maintenance and support of the Pulse IT tool. And yeah, that's about it. I'm gonna start the presentation of this Pulse online tool. What all the team needed was this IT support to reflect all the methodology, all the business logic, all the rules, all the roles that different users have in the assessments to be stored in an IT system. So this is what we did. We have now this Pulse online tool. I'm sure that Dimitri will share with you the URL, and most of you have already entered the tool. This is a secure web portal that you access only with your username and password. Please, next slide. Here we can see what the main administrator can see, which he governs all the main structures within the Pulse methodology, mainly what you already know, the pillars, indicators, and dimensions. And here is where the administrators will start modifying, changing whatever they need regarding the methodology and regarding the templates for the concept notes, template for the reports, etc. And this is something that is applied to every assessment that gets created in the tool. Next, please. The next one, please. The tool has already inside a structure of the template for the concept notes and the reports. We are aiming to be able to test the compliance of the documents that are uploaded into the tool in the near future. There are some magnificent AI tools now that can help us go into this route. But for the moment, we have the template already in the structure of the Pulse IT tool, and we have we have a model of how the concept note and the report should look like. Next one, please. Central government. Okay. the system is, when you log into the system, you have username and password associated to some roles. You may be an administrator or whatever. Besides that, you also have specific roles on a per assessment basis. In this case, we have a user that has association with 4 assessments. And depending on the role that the user has on these assessments and the status of this assessment, then the user can perform the corresponding actions depending on the business logic that has to be applied following the PULSE methodology. So here you can see the list of assessments. You can see what is the status of this assessment, on what step in the assessment you are. For example, for some of them, we have to review the concept note. For others, we have to revise the concept note. And whenever the assessment is on the evaluation phase, then we can see that there are some percentages that start going up with when the assessment is starting to be evaluated. Next one, please. Okay, here is when the user enters to the details of an assessment. We have a small resume of where the assessment is. We have included this. It is not here, but we have included also the sequence of steps that the assessment must follow. And if the user is an assessment team leader, he or she will have windows on the bottom that will start informing on what is the status of the review or of the number of dimensions that have been evaluated, etc. Next, please. In this case, for example, we are exploring what happens when we are revising a concept note. So the reviewers have already done their job. They have uploaded some comments, some documents with the review, and the revisor, if you want, he's ready to download all this documentation, check that everything is fine, and the next thing that he can do is the big green button that has there, submit for approval. So we have tried to include in every step of the way clear buttons or actions that the user must follow. Indeed, that is something, it's okay, you can go to the next. This user friendliness, this is something that we are looking forward to work a lot with the current pilots, and that this is what Dimitri was referring to, that he will have meetings with me and the IT team to explore all the possibilities to enhance this user friendliness. Once the concept note has been revised, we can start evaluating the dimensions. The assessment team leader will have, as I have said, these windows that display what is the status of this phase. So we can go to the next one to score the dimensions. Okay, sorry. Any point in time, any user can see what is the exact methodology that is being applied. So in the assessment details, you can click on methodology and you will have this window with all the pillars, indicators, dimensions. If you click in any one of these texts, pillars, indicators, or dimensions, you will get a pop-up with the detailed information of that particular item in the methodology. So in the case of the dimensions, you will get the whole long page describing exactly what is going on. So you have, besides the support that you have on Word, you also have the support within the tool, so you always have everything in the tool. Next one, please. Okay, when we start scoring the dimensions, we can already see what is the aggregate score of the corresponding indicators, pillars, as you can see here. The system is already calculating all the scores depending on the scores given in the dimensions. If the dimensions do not let the indicator to have a score yet, then you will have a not available score. But so as long as the assessment starts developing, then you will get the aggregated scores on all the items in this page. When you click on one of these dimensions, please go to the next. You will have a detailed description of the dimension. You can see that there is a small green plus button on the right side of the description that shows the complete description. And you just have to click on the letter corresponding to the score of the conceptual or actual score and actual score. So you will have both. For the dimensions that only have conceptual score, you have only one column. So that is already configured in the tool. In this page, you also attach all the documentation and evidence that you have regarding this particular dimension. It is normal that that one document, you might use it as evidence for many dimensions. So in that case, it makes a lot of sense to store the documents in a document repository, and the user can reference this document from the document repository. This is the next slide, please. So we have included in the assessment a document repository. This is where this is a place where you store all the documents related to the assessment, and you have classifications for this type of documents. You also have as you can see, there are 3 tabs there. You can attach documents to the document repository of the assessment. You can also see what are the documents that have been uploaded to only the dimensions, which is evidence. And the user can also upload hyperlinks. And this is something that you see on the 3rd tab. Next one, please. This is a little bit of what I was telling you about the classification in the document repository. So this classification is already standard for all the assessments. Of course, the administrators can change it and will start changing it depending of what they can see in the pilots, and the users start uploading the documents in the corresponding classification when in the assessment phase. And that's about it, I think. Can you go to the next? Yes. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vladimir. We are already running out of time, and we still have 2 points on the agenda. First one goes through the next steps for each country assessment, and then clarify any questions and concerns. So let's briefly discuss the next steps, and then if we have time and colleagues could stay a few more minutes with us, we can discuss any relevant question. Otherwise, we can do it offline, case by case, directly with Karen and Svetlana teams. So in terms of the next steps, maybe let me start with Ukraine and summarize. So the concept note has been completed, and I understand it was reviewed by all peer reviewers. Jose just confirmed that he submitted his review as well. And I understand that Oleg Kansurov also shared his comments, right, Svetlana?
Да, все прислали свои комментарии. Мы их учтем. Если что-то не учтем, мы укажем в матрице комментариев.
Хорошо, я перейду на русский. Если кому-то надо переключить канал. Хорошо, Светлана, тогда давайте, пока мы с Владимиром разбираемся с системой, вы работаете офлайн, подготовьте последний вариант Concept Note, беря во внимание все комментарии. Я вам обещал прислать тоже формат матрицы для комментариев и ответов. Я забыл вчера это сделать, но сегодня обязательно это сделаю. То есть надо будет...
У нас есть, Дмитрий, у нас есть. Мы нашли.
Вы нашли, да? Но мы всегда ими пользуемся с Наташей и с другими членами команды.
Да, Наташа предоставила нам этот формат.
Вот, так что если вы можете подготовить эту матрицу с основными комментариями и дать ваш ответ коротко, то я думаю, это будет достаточно желательно на английском, либо потом Google Translate, потому что мы это тоже добавим в систему, чтобы там было evidence этого процесса.
А матрицу нам также можно будет потом подгрузить в систему, да?
Да, конечно, мы найдем способ. И стандартный темплейт мы тоже попросим Владимира в систему эту забить, чтобы он был там наравне с Concept Note Template виден, и все могли бы его скачать. Хорошо. Тогда как только концептуальная записка обновлена, вы ее можете посылать через систему, попытаемся через систему. И, в принципе, следующий шаг – это чтобы Светлана Воробей его уже формально утвердила. И как только это сделано, мы переходим уже активно к фазе самой оценки.
Да, хорошо.
Да? Если что, мы продублируем и напрямую потом обговорим детали.
Хорошо.
Карен, давайте с вами быстро обговорим следующие шаги. Значит, я так понимаю, что нам пока еще надо подтвердить состав команды, всех членов команды, в том числе внешние проверяющие. Скорее всего, это будет Олег или Иван, но если вдруг нам надо добавить кого-то еще. И имейте в виду, если вам нужна помощь со стороны внешних консультантов, по вашей рекомендации, которых мы можем рассмотреть и нанять, как консультантов Всемирного банка, берите это, пожалуйста, сделайте, обговорите этот вопрос, потому что, конечно, мы не хотим слишком много времени отнимать у вас и Рафи, и Гора, и всей команды. Проще, когда у вас какой-то работает с вами консультант, и вы ему даете или ей определенные задачи, и просто потом проверяете прогресс, работу, и таким образом вы не отвлекаетесь от своей работы. Но это на ваше усмотрение. Если вы думаете, вы можете это сделать своими силами, то еще лучше. Мы только сэкономим тогда на бюджете. Но, пожалуйста, подтвердите и обговорите этот вопрос еще раз.
Да, спасибо, Дмитрий. По поводу экономии мы еще поговорим, потому что, может, мы к вам обратимся попозже. На данный момент мы находимся в процессе подготовки Conceptual Note. Я бы хотел попросить, если есть уже финальная версия Concept Note для Украины, я был бы благодарен, если вы переслали мне. В основном документ готов, там есть некоторые моменты, которые связаны с timing and costs. Мы просто не знаем, что там или какой контент мы должны оставить там, и есть неясность про deliverables. Если будет копия Украины, мы можем пользоваться и увидим, как коллеги сделали. Спасибо.
Конечно, если Светлана Токарева и Людмила не против, мы тогда поделимся с Кареном последней версии, вот, которая на данный момент есть. То есть не обязательно, чтобы вот уже проверенная версия, то, что у нас есть, мы можем поделиться с Кареном. И опять же, Карен, если у вас какие-то конкретные вопросы, пишите прямо мне в любой момент, либо по имейлу, либо мы можем тоже в WhatsApp обменяться. Со Светланой мы постоянно на связи, с Людмилой тоже в WhatsApp. То есть как можно оперативнее мы можем решать все эти вопросы. И, конечно, мы поделимся с вами опытом, вот то, что Украина уже наработала.
Да, на самом деле, спасибо, Дмитрий, вопросов стало намного больше. Будем обратиться к вам в течение работы. Спасибо большое.
Спасибо. Ну и, в принципе, я тоже попросил Люсине подключиться к процессу, то есть Люсине будет представлять нашу команду, то есть тоже, если вам проще обращаться напрямую к Люсине, то, пожалуйста, и потом мы с Люсине уже обсудим детали и организуем встречу, если нужно, виртуально.
Спасибо.
Хорошо. Хорошо, Карен. Тогда от вас мы ждем завершения первого черновика концептуальной записки, и чтобы вы ее разослали через систему. Надеюсь, это у вас получится. С Украиной у нас получилось. Вот только у нас сейчас проблемы с процессом ревью, но мы надеемся, до этого времени мы уже это тоже доработаем и исправим. Хорошо, коллеги, теперь по-быстрому, если есть какие-то вопросы, комментарии, что-то непонятно с процессом, следующими шагов, либо какие-то концептуальные вопросы, вот, что похоже на вопрос, который был у Рафи, пожалуйста, задавайте. По-моему, у нас в сборе все команды, то есть ответ мы по-любому постараемся найти.
Ну, у нас нет вопросов. Пока все понятно. Может быть, будут возникать по ходу оценки. Ну, это, думаю, индивидуально мы будем обращаться. Не будем отнимать время у коллег.
Хорошо. Карен, Рафи, Гор.
Много вопросов, но на данный момент не хочу задавать. В процессе будем на связи.
Давайте, если много вопросов, организуем короткую встречу на следующей неделе с вашей командой и уже детально все обсудим, если вы не против.
Спасибо.
Хорошо. Ну, с моей стороны, перед тем, как уже завершим нашу встречу, только хотел еще раз вас попросить всех, пожалуйста, документируйте все проблемы, все issues, все inconsistency, которые вы идентифицируете, как и в концептуальном фреймворке, то есть dimensions, indicators, pillars, так особенно в системе. То есть если вы видите, что что-то не сходится, что-то не так выглядит, что-то можно улучшить, то, пожалуйста, пишите напрямую мне, можете копировать Владимира, он был приглашен на эту встречу, и мы с Владимиром периодически встречаемся и обговариваем все те улучшения или проблемы, которые были идентифицированы. То есть я знаю, что это дополнительная работа, но, пожалуйста, обратите на это внимание, включая Олега и Ливана. То есть нам нужно услышать фидбэк от всех участников, и вы у нас единственные два external validators, то есть какие-то функции нам недоступны и только доступны вам, поэтому тоже для нас очень важно знать, что на данный момент все работает, или если не работает, то где надо что-то улучшить. Хорошо, коллеги. Наталья, Хосе, Ульян, Люсине. Какие-нибудь комментарии с вашей стороны, Анара?
No, thank you, Dmitry.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Тогда всем огромное спасибо за ваше время, за ваше участие, внимание. И мы будем обязательно на связи уже напрямую с каждой из команд. Хорошего вам вечера и мира.